It was May 1936 in Texas at Fort Parker. A young woman, only 17, saw warriors strike down her father-in-law with a war club. Her mother-in-law was stabbed and left bleeding on the ground. Before a scream could escape her lips, she was captured by the warriors and thrown onto a horse. At 6 months pregnant, her name was Rachel Plamer. For the next 21 months, she would endure horrors so profound that even years later, in the safety of her father's house, she refused to fully describe them in her published memoir. She simply wrote, "To try and narrate their treatment would only increase my current distress, as I think of it with the deepest feelings of humiliation, let alone speak or write about it." Rachel Plamer was one of many. Throughout the 1800s, native tribes in the American Southwest captured countless women from settlements on the frontier. Some were eventually ransomed and returned to their families after long negotiations. A few managed to escape during moments of confusion and walk hundreds of miles back to civilization. However, most were never heard from again. The ones who did return brought back stories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Stories they found almost impossible to share. These were tales that 19th century newspapers, which typically printed every gruesome detail of public executions, sometimes declined to publish in their entirety. This isn't just frontier lore. These are documented facts from court testimonies given under oath and memoirs published by the survivors themselves, sold to thousands of people who wanted to know the truth of what happened in the wilderness. I am Crown and Dagger, and here we confront these truths. If you think these stories need to be told, please support this channel by liking and subscribing, because what you're about to hear is something your history teacher probably skipped. Let's start where it always began. The raids consistently followed a similar pattern. Warriors would attack at dawn or dusk, when the light was poor and families were at their most exposed. The easiest targets were isolated homesteads, where families lived miles from anyone who might hear their cries for help. The men in the household were always killed first. Husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons old enough to use a rifle were usually eliminated within the first few minutes. There was no discussion, no forewarning, and no mercy, just brutal efficiency. After that, the selection would start. Women of childbearing age were considered the most valuable. They could perform labor, be traded to other tribes, or be sold to Mexican traders who ran slave markets in the northern territories. They could also become wives and have children who would be raised as full members of the tribe. Young girls under the age of 10 were also highly sought after because they could be brought up within the tribe and over time forget their previous lives completely. With enough time, they would learn the language, adopt the customs, and have no memory of who they once were. The elderly were killed on the spot. They were unable to work or have children and would only slow down the raiding party on the long journey back to their camp. Infants were also killed. A crying baby could give away the group's location to anyone in pursuit. They were risks the warriors were not willing to take. The selection process was cold, practical, and devoid of emotion. Olive Oatman was just 14 when warriors attacked her family near the Gila River in Arizona in February 1851. Her family had been journeying west with a group of settlers, but disagreements over the route had left them traveling alone. The Oatmans continued on by themselves, believing they were only a few days away from safety. They were mistaken. Olive witnessed her father being beaten to death with clubs and her mother killed right next to him, along with her older sister and baby brother. In a matter of minutes, 4 of her siblings were murdered while she stood frozen in terror. When the violence ended, only Olive and her 7-year-old sister, Marianne, were left alive. The warriors took them into the desert. Olive later recounted walking barefoot through the wilderness for an entire night, over sharp rocks that cut her feet and through patches of cactus that left countless spines in her skin. There was no food, no water, and no rest. Every time she stumbled from pure exhaustion, she was hit with clubs. Whenever she slowed down, she was beaten until she moved faster. Her little sister walked beside her, bleeding from her own injuries, too scared to cry and too tired to speak. By morning, Olive's feet were so swollen and torn that each step felt like walking on broken glass. But she continued to move because she knew that stopping meant death. And that was just the first night. Once the captives arrived at the tribal camp, their new life began right away. They were not treated as guests waiting to be rescued or as prisoners for ransom. They were no longer considered people. They were property. The women were forced to work from the very first day, before their wounds could heal, before they had a proper meal, and before they could get any sleep. They gathered firewood until their hands were cracked and bleeding, carried heavy clay pots of water for miles under the harsh desert sun, scraped animal hides until their fingers were raw, and dug for edible roots in the hard, dry ground. They had to carry loads that would have exhausted a grown man. They were given every task that no one else wanted to do. Any job that was too demeaning or too tiring for the tribe members became their responsibility. They were the last to eat, getting only the scraps left after the entire tribe had eaten. If a hunt was unsuccessful, there might be nothing left for them at all. They would go to sleep hungry and wake up before sunrise to start working again. Rachel Plamer described her initial months with the Comanches, stating, "I was kept working constantly from the earliest morning until late in the evening. When I didn't complete my tasks to their liking, they beat me with clubs and sticks. My existence was a continuous cycle of fear, pain, and misery. The beatings were frequent and unpredictable. They happened for working too slowly, for showing any sign of exhaustion, for crying out when the pain was too much, or for speaking English to another captive. Sometimes the beatings happened for no clear reason at all, simply because they were there, powerless, and because there were no repercussions for their abusers. Olive Oatman was enslaved by the Yavapai for a full year before she was traded to the Mojave tribe. During that time, she and her younger sister Marianne were worked almost to death, beaten often, and fed only what others didn't want. They had no protection from the intense Arizona sun or the cold desert nights. Marianne was only 7 years old. Her small body could not endure the constant abuse, starvation, and endless work. She started to fade away, getting thinner and weaker each week. Olive had to watch her little sister slowly die, seeing the light disappear from her eyes as she turned into a shadow of the happy child she once was. And there was absolutely nothing Olive could do to save her. But what ultimately broke these women wasn't the hard labor or the starvation. It was what happened when they disobeyed, or sometimes when they had done nothing wrong at all. Matilda Lockhart was 13 years old when she was taken by Comanches in Texas in 1838. She was just a child, a farmer's daughter who had never hurt anyone. She endured 2 terrible years in captivity before she was returned during peace talks in San Antonio in March 1840. When the Texan authorities saw her condition, they were left speechless. Tough frontiersmen who had seen violence their whole lives stood in stunned silence. A witness named Mary Maverick, who helped clean and dress the girl after her release, later wrote in her diary about what she saw. Her head, arms, and face were covered in bruises and sores. Her nose was literally burnt off to the bone, with all the fleshy part gone, and a large scab had formed on the bone's end. Both her nostrils were wide open and stripped of flesh. Matilda, speaking in a faint whisper, explained how it had happened. The women of the tribe had made a cruel game of torturing her. They would wake her up by pressing burning sticks to her face. Her nose was their preferred spot. Night after night, week after week, for months, her screams were a source of amusement for them. The smell of her own burning flesh made them laugh. In the end, there was nothing left to burn. Her entire body was covered in similar marks, burns on her arms, back, and legs. It was evidence of a systematic cruelty that was not for punishment or discipline, but for the sake of inflicting suffering. Mary Maverick noted that Matilda was utterly degraded and could not hold up her head again. Matilda Lockhart never recovered from what was done to her, neither physically, mentally, nor spiritually. She passed away 2 years after being rescued. Her body was too damaged to go on, and her spirit was too broken to want to. She was only 15 years old when she died. Fire was a tool that the tribes knew how to use well. Sometimes captives were tied to the ground and burned slowly. The fires were intentionally kept small to make the suffering last for hours. This was typically done to male prisoners or to send a message to their enemies. More often, fire was used for daily discipline. Heated metal was pressed against the skin. Burning coals were placed on arms and legs, and sticks were pulled from campfires and pressed against faces to wake captives or to punish them for small mistakes. The smell of burning flesh became a normal, expected part of life. But the most terrible use of fire was as a form of group punishment. After the council house fight in San Antonio in March 1840, where Texan authorities killed several Comanche chiefs during what was meant to be a peaceful negotiation, the tribe took revenge on the captives they still held. 13 prisoners were tied to the ground, and small, carefully managed fires were built around them, designed to cause the most amount of pain over the longest possible time. The torture lasted for hours. Matilda Lockhart's younger sister, who was only 6 years old, was among them. When another Comanche group arrived weeks later to negotiate for other captives, they brought a survivor who described everything that had happened in horrifying detail. The message was clear. If you cross us, everyone you care about will suffer in ways you can't even begin to imagine. Consider this for a moment. These were women who had never harmed anyone. Farmers' wives, daughters, mothers, and children. They were taken from everything and everyone they knew and loved and forced to endure years of systematic torture. Some were held for months, others for years, and some for decades. What would you have done if you were in this situation? How long do you think you could have survived? Share your thoughts in the comments. There was another ordeal the captives had to face, a ritual meant to break their spirits from the very first day. It was known as running the gauntlet. The captive was made to run between two long lines of warriors who were armed with clubs, sticks, whips, and anything else that could inflict pain. Each person in the lines would strike the captive as they ran past. The objective was straightforward: make it to the end while still on your feet. Those who fell were beaten until they managed to get up again. Those who couldn't get up faced an even worse fate. The gauntlet had several purposes. It was a form of entertainment for the tribe and a celebration of a successful raid. It was also a method to immediately crush the captive's spirit and show them their new lowly position in the world. And it was a test. Those who showed courage, refused to cry out, and kept running, no matter how many times they were hit, sometimes received slightly better treatment afterward. Those who displayed weakness only invited more abuse. Rachel Plamer wrote about having to endure the gauntlet multiple times during her 21 months of captivity. She learned the hard way that showing pain only led to more violence, and that crying out only made them hit her harder. They respected bravery above all else, she wrote years later. I wish I had understood that sooner. By the end of her captivity, Rachel had learned to defend herself. When one of her captors attacked her, she fought back so fiercely that the warriors watching actually laughed and cheered. They admired her spirit and her refusal to be broken. From that day on, her treatment improved, not by a lot, but enough for her to notice. Most captives never figured this out. They remained victims, getting weaker each day until they either died in captivity or were finally ransomed back to families who could barely recognize them. Some women had a completely different destiny. They were taken as wives. This might seem like a better situation, and in some respects it was. So wives ate with the tribe instead of having scraps. They were subjected to less random physical violence, and they had a clear role in the social structure. They had someone who, in their own way, was responsible for them, but they had absolutely no say in the matter. Young women were given to warriors as rewards for successful raids. They were expected to perform all the duties of a wife, both domestic and otherwise. Any form of resistance was met with violence until the resistance ceased. Some women eventually came to accept their new lives, not because they wanted to, but because acceptance was the only path to survival. Cynthia Ann Parker was captured at the age of 9 in the same raid that took Rachel Plamer, the attack on Fort Parker in May 1836. She was just a child who watched her family get killed before being carried away into a world she couldn't comprehend. But unlike Rachel, Cynthia Ann didn't spend just 21 months in captivity. She spent 24 years. She grew up as a Comanche, learning their language, customs, and beliefs. She married a war chief named Pita Nakona and had 3 children with him, a daughter named Toposana, whom she called Prairie Flower, and 2 sons. One of her sons would later become the legendary Quanah Parker, the last great chief of the Comanche people. By all accounts, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, her children, and the life she had created. When Texas Rangers finally located her in December 1860, she had no desire to be rescued. She fought against them, screaming for her husband and begging to be allowed to stay with her family. They took her anyway. Her husband, Peter Nakona, was either killed in the raid or died soon after from his wounds. The stories vary. Her sons managed to escape and she never saw them again. Only her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, was taken with her into what became a new form of captivity. For Cynthia Ann, being rescued was like being captured all over again. She spent the last 10 years of her life trying to escape and return to the Comanches, to her sons, and to the only life she knew. She never succeeded. She was constantly watched and guarded by family members who believed they were helping her. She died in 1870, completely heartbroken. Some historians think she simply stopped eating after Prairie Flower died from the flu. They believe she intentionally starved herself, choosing death over a life among people who had become strangers to her. She had been saved from the only family she could remember, and the experience destroyed her. Perhaps nothing shows the cruelty of frontier captivity more than what happened to the children. Rachel Plamer's 2-year-old son, James, was ripped from her arms during the raid on Fort Parker. She never saw him again during her time in captivity. But it was the fate of her second child that remains a haunting part of history. 6 months into her captivity, Rachel gave birth to a son. For 6 weeks, she did her best to care for him. Then the warriors decided the baby was making her work too slowly. In her own words, "They took my child from me. I never saw him alive again." She was only 20 years old. Rachel Plamer was eventually ransomed. When her father saw her for the first time after her return, he barely recognized his own daughter. She was skeletal, covered in scars, and her eyes held a look that wasn't there before. She wrote her memoir, which became one of the first captivity narratives published in Texas. She became pregnant again and gave birth to a healthy son, but she died 2 months later. Her body had simply given up. Her son James, the 2-year-old who had been torn from her arms, was eventually ransomed and returned to the family in 1842. He was 8 years old and had spent 6 years with the Comanches, long enough to completely forget his birth family. Olive Oatman was released after spending 5 years with the Mojave tribe. Unlike the brutal treatment she received from the Yavapai, her time with the Mojave was more complicated. They had adopted her, given her land to farm, but she was still a captive and was not allowed to leave. When she finally walked into Fort Yuma in 1856, she weighed just 80 pounds and could hardly speak English. The words came out slowly and with great effort, as if she were translating from another language. And across her chin were 5 blue lines, a permanent declaration to everyone she would ever meet that she had been marked by another world. Olive became famous, going on lecture tours and publishing a book that turned her into a symbol of frontier survival. She married a cattleman and lived a quiet life in Texas for many years, but she never truly went back to being the person she was before. Her husband reportedly spent years trying to buy and burn every copy of her memoir he could find, attempting to give her peace from a past that would never release its grip. Until the day she died, she kept a jar of Mojave mesquite seeds on her shelf, a small memento of a life she could never fully escape. By the 1870s, historians estimate that at least 30% of the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache populations had captive ancestry. The line between settlers and natives was much more blurred than 19th century Americans wanted to admit, and far more complex than the simple tales of civilization versus savagery that newspapers loved to publish. Some captives became fully assimilated. They learned the language fluently, adopted all the customs, married warriors, and had children who grew up as full members of the tribe with no memory of any other life. When rescue parties finally found them, and family members traveled hundreds of miles to bring them home, they refused to leave. They had become someone else, and that new person did not want to go back. Others endured years of horror and came out as mere shadows of their former self. They were the walking wounded who could never completely heal, who would flinch at sudden movements and wake up screaming from nightmares decades after their rescue. They could never explain to their families what had truly happened because the words to describe it simply did not exist. And thousands just vanished, taken in raids and never seen again. They left no memoirs to tell their stories, no testimonies to record their suffering, and no graves for their families to visit. They became just names on old documents, entries in faded records, and the subject of a lifetime of wondering, hoping, and praying for families who never received any news. The frontier was not a place of clear-cut heroes and villains. It was not the romantic adventure depicted in dime novels. It was a place of survival, brutal, bloody, and uncompromising, where everyone on all sides committed acts that would leave a dark stain on the land for generations. The women who survived captivity carried their experiences with them forever, in their scars, in their silences, and in the things they couldn't bring themselves to write about, even in their own memoirs, years later, in the safety of their home. Rachel Plamer wrote that some things were too terrible to describe, that some memories were too painful to put into words. Matilda Lockhart's disfigured face spoke more powerfully than any words ever could. Olive Oatman's blue tattoo declared her history to everyone she met for the rest of her life. A permanent mark, a permanent reminder, a permanent story written on her skin. They survived what should not be survivable. They endured what should not be endurable. They lived when so many others did not, and they left behind testimonies that compel us to remember what the American frontier truly was. Not an adventure, not a story of triumph, but a nightmare that spanned generations. Freckles these women as victims, and they certainly were, every single one of them. But they were also something more. They were survivors. They were witnesses. They were the ones who returned to tell us what happened in places no one else could see, in places the rest of America would rather forget. Their stories are important. Their suffering is important. Their courage is important. Because if we forget them, we forget the truth about who we were and who we are now. If you want to hear more history that others won't tell you, subscribe to Crown and Dagger. We don't look away. Suggestions: can you help me find historical accounts of other frontier captivities? What are some other historical events that are often overlooked or misrepresented? Can you summarize the main points of this script in a few sentences? Ask a follow-up.